Thanks so much. Those are three extraordinary panels. Andy, I have two quick questions for you. Is it possible that KSM can get off free because of mentioning waterboarding, that he wasn't read his Miranda rights, and that because government officials have been running around saying that they're sure he'll be convicted, he hasn't had presumption of innocence? Also, to project into the future, if does invite an attack, of course it does, on American soil, and there is one, is it possible then to sue the Holder and Obama and those people for reckless endangerment, criminal negligence? Give me something. I'm not a lawyer.
I'll take the second one first.
Okay.
The likelihood of suing the government is very unlikely because it has sovereign immunity from those sorts of suits. And frankly, whether we're able to sue them or not will be the least of our problems if that were to come to pass. I don't expect that KSM will get acquitted. I think what's going to happen is the government will, if we can't stop this monstrosity from happening, which I haven't given up hope that we can, what they'll do is they'll use the overhaul of the law that was done in 1996, which gave prosecutors a much better arsenal to go after terrorism cases in the civilian courts. They will indict it, I would anticipate, with the beginning of the case being a sort of an overarching al-Qaeda conspiracy going back to 1988 and going straight through 9/11. That doesn't require, it's a life count, but it doesn't require, what I mean is it's a life imprisonment count, but it doesn't require you to prove that they actually did any specific act. They just have to be members of the agreement to make war on the United States. They may also make use of the charge we brought against the Blind Sheikh, which makes it a crime to conspire to levy war against the United States, if you have at least one person here who did it, which obviously they have. That would get them pretty easy, I think, convictions on a life count and 20-year count. And then what I think you do is you have separately indicted all the different acts of terrorism. And remember, KSM has been under indictment in the United States since, I think, 1996. So we had a prosecutable case on him 5 years before there was a 9/11. Where you may see acquittals, I think, are on counts related to specific acts of terrorism where they just don't have enough to get over the hump on one act or another. But I would anticipate that everybody will be convicted of something severe. And I also think, to be honest, when a jury finds you guilty of the overarching al-Qaeda conspiracy, it makes it much easier for the jury also to get over the hump and convict you on each individual act of terrorism. So I have an op-ed this morning in the Daily News, in New York Daily News, about this, in which I said the problem with this case, or the problem with this journey, is not the destination, it's the journey itself. It's all the things we have to do to get from beginning to end, including giving up our national defense information.
If you want to do something about this trial, on the 5th of December in New York City, a place to be determined, but it'll be somewhere in proximity to Ground Zero, there will be a very substantial rally of people who have been involved in the 9/11 trauma as family members, as firefighters, police officers, military personnel, and so on. I believe Andy McCarthy will be one of those participating in this, and we hope to have a really all-star cast there to kick off a campaign that we hope will, on the 7th of December, a day that lives still, I think, in infamy, an opportunity to have people all across this country go into the district offices of their representatives and insist that this travesty be stopped. So I encourage you all to check with us about that if you'd like to know more. I just wanted to draw you guys out on something that, Andy, you've written about, Steve, you mentioned, and Robert, I know you've thought extensively about, which is this question of the nature of the enemy. Is it, in fact, radical Islam? Or is it, as Andy has written, mainstream Islam? Or is it, as Robert has written, Sharia, which is the essential authoritative version of Islam? And if you could share your thoughts on that question, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Well, with all respect to everyone here, there's a little slippage in the terminology. I mean, when one says radical Islam, the question would become then, well, does that mean somebody who is acting radically on the basis of Islamic teachings, or somebody who's twisting Islamic teachings in a radical direction when actually those teachings are peaceful? In reality, mainstream and authoritative Islam, all the schools of Islamic jurisprudence and all the sects of Islam that are recognized as mainstream, all of them teach in common, without exception, that it is part of the responsibility of the Muslim community worldwide to wage war against unbelievers, to impose Sharia upon them, and to subjugate them and deny them equality of rights. And see how see, that's the bigotry alarm. The politically correct people put that in. It's coming. It's an Obama innovation.
It's the call to prayer.
In any case, that's not actually bigotry or hatred to say, because it's a demonstrable fact. The teachings of the authoritative schools are a matter of record. All you have to do is look at them. The problem is nobody has looked at them. Now, certainly, does that mean that every Muslim is acting upon these teachings? Of course not. There's a spectrum within Islam, as there is within every religious tradition, of belief and knowledge and fervor. Some people know the teachings very well and are acting upon them, and some people don't know and don't care, but still identify themselves as part of the religious community, and there's about every shade of variation in between as well. And so there are Muslims, you could say, who are radical in the sense that they are acting upon these teachings and calling upon other Muslims to do so. But the teachings themselves, in terms of Islamic theology and law, are not radical at all. They're mainstream, they're authoritative. There is, unfortunately, no substance, no truth to the common claim that this is the province of a tiny minority of extremists who have twisted and hijacked the teachings of Islam. Actually, there are no peaceful teachings of Islam. They cannot be found and have never been produced. They're just like the great unicorn that everyone believes in, but nobody's ever actually seen.
When we talk about mainstream Islam, and Frank, you know this as well as I do, the mainstream groups in the United States are all Muslim Brotherhood groups. All of the Muslim Brotherhood groups are subsets of the larger Muslim Brotherhood worldwide, which controls the media, which controls Al-Azhar, which controls the religious theocracies within the Muslim world. So, quote, the mainstream groups within Islam are radical. We equate the term mainstream with moderate, but the word mainstream doesn't mean moderate. It means average. And the average common denominator within those, quote, mainstream groups is the Muslim Brotherhood, which endorses the Sharia, the Code of Islamic Law. So in fact, there are Muslims like Zuhdi Jasser who are genuine moderates and represent a moderate faction of Islam. But when you talk about the leadership and the center of religious and political gravity, as you correctly pointed out, it belongs with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is Wahhabist, which is Salafist, which believes in the Sharia, which believes in the Code of Islamic Law, which believes in the use of, which believes in the inequality of women, which believes in the permission to beat women. So it encompasses a whole range of radical notions that we normally would associate with radical, which is radical, but in fact, which is mainstream.
I think we have a profound political problem in that there is Islam and then there are Muslims. And we talk about Islam in terms of Islamic doctrine. And then the media shoots back, but there are all these Muslims, and they're self-evidently not blowing stuff up. And in that way, I think, make us, who are trying to focus on the ideology, look like we're crazy people. But the problem is, and I was telling a couple of people about this last night, when we tried the blind sheikh, we had a parade of Muslims come in to testify in his defense. Authentically moderate people. They were obviously likable people. They certainly weren't terrorists. Nevertheless, during the defense case, every now and then an issue of Islamic law would come up. What does jihad mean? What does this concept mean? What does that concept mean? And at least 3 times during the defense case, the witness asked that question. Authentic, moderate people would look over to the corner of the courtroom where the guy I had been telling the jury was an insane homicidal maniac was sitting, and they would say, I'm not competent to answer that. You would have to ask Dr. Abdul Rahman, the blind sheikh. And to me, the striking thing about that, and I think the frightening thing for all of us, is that here you had these people who were authentically moderate, peaceful people, and yet in connection with an authoritative interpretation of key terms in their own religion, they were willing, and they had to be in a sense, to delegate this guy, who was a dyed-in-the-wool terrorist, to be basically their compass for what their religion meant. And I think what that says is we have two really bad problems. Number one, the media doesn't want to see the problems with the ideology, so they focus on the fact that the vast majority of Muslims are not participating in terrorist activity. But on the other hand, the vast majority of Muslims also don't have an intellectual argument to make against the radicals who are pointing at the doctrine. You know, the blind sheikh ended up not testifying in the trial, but I had to get ready to cross-examine him because if he testified, that obviously had to be done. And I thought, you know, if what we were saying as a government and as a Justice Department was true, if these guys had perverted Islam and were twisting a religion of peace into something that it wasn't, surely in all these voluminous collections of his speeches and writings that I had, there must be 3 or 4 places where I could nail him on where he had twisted the doctrine or perverted the doctrine. There wasn't one. There was not a single place where, in justifying or commanding acts of terrorism, he said that the Scripture said something where if you went back and checked him, he was wrong. And that's the problem.
I can't get it straight. This man pleaded guilty, asked for execution, and now we're having a trial. I mean, is he now saying he's completely innocent?
No,
I don't understand.
I'm sorry. He never pleaded guilty. He announced his intention to plead guilty, and I believe it was a letter to the court, but there was never a formal proceeding. And then very shortly after that, the Obama administration came into power and basically suspended all the military commissions so they could study them. And that's what the announcement last week was about.
So that letter saying he's guilty isn't a confession?
Well, it's a confession in the sense that it's a statement where he takes responsibility and says he did it, but it's not a formal guilty plea, which has a very elaborate procedure that's covered by the law, even in the military system.
Can I just point out that there was another case, and maybe, Andy, you can amplify. This happened last year. There were 5 Rwandans who were extradited from Rwanda for genocide, and they had actually confessed to committing mass murder. A judge in New York State threw out the confessions on the basis that the prisoners were not Mirandized, and he ordered them to be freed from jail. So the government is appealing, but if the government loses, these 5 men will be walking the streets of New York having committed genocide in Rwanda because a judge will have ruled that the confession was unacceptable. Is that possible in the case of KSM?
It's certainly possible that confession evidence won't come in because it's not, when I say come in, I mean be admitted at trial. Because it hasn't been Mirandized. You know, look, a number of people, myself included, have been arguing since around 2004 that we ought to try to meld the 2 different paradigms we have for attacking this problem from a legal perspective, you know, the criminal justice system and the military system, and come up with a better system, a hybrid national security court. I have a fairly elaborate